"They're ready for you, Doctor," Nurse Chastain said, as she stuck her head through the double doors. Dr. Clyde didn't look up from his wash sink, where he stood mentally preparing himself for the coming surgery. Dr. Clive, just docked with the nurses in his OR, started every surgery by reminding himself that he was the hand of God, sent to cure the sick and heal the living. He was God's instrument, and he must help those in need so that he might fulfill his purpose. He finished his cleansing ritual and stepped through the same double doors the nurse had just exited. The gleaming surgical suite was awash with men and women garbed for surgery. The nurse stepped forward, gowning and gloving Clive as he stepped closer to the table. The trays were laid out just so, the breather nearby, his patient prepped and ready. Clive took a moment to glance up at the theater seating around the top of the sunken operating room and saw Steiner and Merkel, along with a few curious onlookers, sitting and observing as he began. Then he cast his gaze still higher as he basked in the radiance that flowed down from God like manna from heaven, coming through the glass ceiling above the gallery. St. Mercus Hospital was one of the few hospitals in the country with an operating theater. The administration thought it was good for business, letting guests who desired witness surgeries beyond anything they could ever imagine. The tagline for the operating theater was, "Come see God's miracles daily," on the promotional materials, and Dr. Marcus Clive was the chief performer of those miracles. He made eye contact with Dr. Steiner and had to remind himself not to wink at him. He was above such baser gloating, even if it would really get Steiner's goat. He knew as well as Steiner did that it was a prestigious honor to operate here, an honor granted only to Clive these days. He had never had a surgical mishap, never lost a patient, and had no black marks to his name. They had called him a prodigy at Johns Hopkins, just like his father. Unlike his father, he had not been snared by the bottle or by the lust of the flesh. He kept a clear head and was a dutiful spouse, unlike his father. "Unlike Gwendolyn," the voice of the serpent whispered. He shook that voice off. That was the voice of darkness. What do we have today?" he asked Nurse Breacher. "Male, Mr. David Gross, here for an aortic valve replacement, Doctor." Clive smiled behind his mask as he held out his hands for the scalpel. He could have done this procedure in his sleep. "That was inspired, Doc. I don't think I've ever seen a replacement go that smoothly." Clive washed his hands, closing his eyes as he spoke the ending of his mantra. "I think Dr. Steiner stayed for the whole procedure." He could almost see Nurse Beecher's smile as she spoke. She was leaning against the scrub sink, Clive just finishing washing his hands. The washing was how it always began, and how it always ended. It cleansed him, made him clean before the eyes of God. He looked down as he washed, but had to look away and keep scrubbing. The blood was so thick there, he had wallowed in it, been stained by it. God's instruments are often hard to clean after they've served his purpose. Some of us are going out for drinks. I wanted to know, if you'd like to come with us. She twirled her fingers through her hair when she said it, looking like some high school girl trying to figure out if a boy liked her or not. Clive had seen her look at him like that for the last few years, and it always made him uncomfortable. If she desired him, then it would be best that she never say. He was a married man. She wanted too much of him. Who was she to try and test his bonds with Gwendolyn? Who was she to test the will of God's? Her hand felt warm on his when she covered it as she sat on the wash sink. "I know things have been hard for you, Doc, but they could be better. We could..." He shook his hand away. "I need to go." She turned away, hurt but not surprised. "Next time," she said hopefully. He knew that time would never come. Steiner was waiting by the elevator, almost as if he were waiting for Clive. "Great show today, Doc. Really, great show," he said, flashing that huge toothpaste commercial smile of his. Clive had always been unnerved by that smile. Steiner looked like a doctor from a soap opera. Swooped back blonde hair, chiseled jawline, body by Bowflex, crammed under a white coat. Many of the nurses lusted after him. Some of them had followed him to bed, but Clive had always felt uneasy around him. That mouth was too wide. his jaw threatening to unhinge like a snake when he talked. A mouth like that would swallow you whole, and he suspected that might be Steiner's plan for replacing him. Just swallow him whole, bones and all. Clive said nothing. He just pushed the down button as he prepared to leave for the day. "I talked to the board today, Clive. Mr. Mason doesn't think it's fair that you get to use the theater and no one else does." Mason's a godless fool, a Darwin worshipper who has no place inside these walls. Steiner smiled that too wide grin, and Clive had to stop himself from shuddering. "I'll be sure to tell him that." The door opened and Clive stepped inside, Steiner following after him. The door closed, locking the two of them inside this falling coffin. "Regardless, he's given me time in the theater next week. I've got a tricky bit of brain surgery that he thinks the public might like to see. It looks like you're not the star of the theater anymore." Clive scoffed, turning his stoic face into the oncoming leer. "I wish you well of it. May your efforts be to please and glorify God, and not simply to prop up your own damaged ego." His smile then became a real sneer. "That creepy, holier-than-thou-are bullcrap you spew isn't going to win you any favors here anymore. Daughtry and Morris are stepping down in a few months, and Simons will be gone by the end of the year. Clements is a weak-willed snail, and Mason will be free to move in some individuals with a less narrow outlook. Your days are numbered, Marcus." Clive didn't flinch from the sneer. Daniel never flinched within the lion's den, and certainly Steiner was no lion. He and Merkel could hover over him as he worked, but they'd gained nothing for their efforts. Clive was above the judgment of man. He answered only to God, and God's will would be done. "If that is the will of God, then I shall bow to it." Steiner scoffed. "You can use your God as a veil for your pompousness, but the rest of us can see what it really is. Pride cometh before a fall, Doc, and your fall will be long indeed from atop your high horse." When the doors opened, Steiner pushed past him and skulked out into the hospital at large. Clive let him get a dozen paces away before leaving for the parking garage. It was late afternoon, and the autumn leaves scuttled across the parking deck like skeletal rats. He walked through the rows of cars to the service elevator and took it down to the sub-basement. The maintenance men had looked at him like he was crazy when he'd asked them to put his spot down there, but Clive didn't want to park his BMW somewhere with high traffic. The car was his pride and joy, the first vehicle he had bought after becoming a doctor, and some days he felt like he loved it more than his wife. It was almost a decade old, but the chrome still shined, the paint was still immaculate, and the engine purred as if it had been the first day he'd driven it off the lot. The doors opened on the sub-basement, and Clive was pleased to see that his was the only vehicle here. He walked across the concrete tomb, one of the lights flickering overhead, and stood halfway to his car when he thought he heard the same skeletal scraping of leaves. He glanced around. Surely there were no leaves down here. No wind either, even if there were. He was 5 floors underground. The sound of his sensible shoes clocking on the pavement must have been what he heard. But as he started again, he stopped after hearing the same noise. It sounded strange in this place, but the noise sounded like laughter. Not real laughter. It was that false laughter that polite or rude people make sometimes. He had known people in his career who would laugh at any joke in just that way, if it came from the lips of a superior. It was false, a lie, and Clive had never stooped to such since becoming a man. He was still convinced that it must have been his shoes, the clump of his heels somehow making that sound as it bounced off the shadowy corners of the garage. But as he approached the car, he became less sure of it. As he approached his comfortable BMW, he could almost feel someone's eyes on him. That scuttling, skittering laughter blew like a wind across the pavement. He clicked the key fob as it got closer and closer, seeing the lights blink and hearing the cheery horn toot. He took a step towards the car, meaning to get in, then turned suddenly to confront whatever prankster thought they were funny. No one would scare him, whether it be in the light of day or the darkest tomb. He was God's instrument, an extension of his love and mercy, and he would not stand for being hounded by some cat's paw of Steiner's or Mercer or Mr. Mason himself. He turned and found no one behind him, just an empty garage and his uneasy breathing. He closed the door behind him as he climbed behind the wheel of his car. He felt comfortable behind the wheel. He felt in control again, and he pulled out his phone to check his messages before driving away. He had asked Gwendolyn if she intended to come to Mass with him tonight before going to wash for surgery. She hadn't gone to Wednesday Mass since the miscarriage. That had been a dark day for Clive, a dark day for both of them, but he had seen it as a sign that it wasn't time for him to have a child. When the time was right, God would bless him with one. Gwendolyn had taken it very differently, having a lapse of faith and a general stagnation of her relationship with God and the church. That had been a year ago, though, and it was time to get back in the Lord's good graces. It was time to stop all this dalliance and get back on the righteous path. Her response had been short. "Go without me. I have plans." Clive thought of asking who these plans were with. The gardener, her tennis coach, her fitness instructor, some stranger that she would drag into their marital bed to satisfy her lust. His fingers hovered over the buttons to do just that, but instead, he put the phone away and started the car. Gwendolyn would come back to the fold eventually. She would see the error of her ways, and he recoiled in his seat, his knees hitting the horn as his brain tried to make sense of what he had seen. There had been a face outside the window, an eyeless, inky black thing with grinning teeth and a too-wide mouth. That mouth reminded him a little of Steiner, and he felt his breath hitch in his throat as he looked back to confirm what was imprinted on his memory. It was gone, though, when he turned back. The only thing reflecting was his own haggard face. He shook his head. Maybe he'd been working too hard lately. Maybe all this was starting to catch up with him. Maybe it was time for a break, a chance to relax and reflect. He shook the thoughts away. God's instrument never rested. He pulled out of the parking garage and turned for St. Dominic's. He needed to bask in the glory of God before returning to the Sodom that his home had become. He arrived home just as the front door opened, and Gwendolyn walked out with her personal trainer. They were mooning at each other, hand in hand, and as they came onto the wide front porch, their hands slipped from each other's when they saw his car in the driveway. Clive had never bothered to learn the man's name. He was one in a long line of lovers that his wife had brought home over the past year. He didn't linger on the front porch. He said his goodbyes and was pulling out 30 seconds later. Clive prayed daily that that wasn't the only pulling out that he was doing. He also prayed that she was being safe, if not smart. She was waiting for him on the porch as he sat in his car. Clearly she wanted to talk, to put his mind at ease, that they were just friends, or he was just here for his session, or some other excuse. He looked in the rearview mirror to be sure the man had left, and cringed away before turning to look in the back seat. He was panting as he scanned the back, eyes darting like a scared animal. The thing from the garage had been there, had turned and grinned at him, but now there was... He jumped, hitting his head on the ceiling as someone knocked on the glass. It was Gwendolyn. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice muffled by the glass. "It looked like something startled you." He killed the engine and stepped out of the car, sending his wife stepping back so the door didn't hit her. "I'm fine. I see your plans went well." She followed in his wake as he walked towards the house, timid and unsure. "Randy came over for a private session, since it's hard for me to make it to the gym these days." Clive commented as he walked into the house. "You're home early," she said awkwardly, as the two of them stepped into the grand old house that had once been Clive's childhood home. "Service ended at 8. It's now 8:30. I'm home exactly when I should be," Clive said icily. "You're the one who's late in sending your plans home," was what he wanted to say. She had made him a cuckold, and all he could manage was passive aggression with her. He paused in the entryway, looking into the living room where his father's chair still sat. He had allowed her to redecorate every room except for this one, The couches, the old photos, that canary yellow rug his mother had loved so much, and of course the tan leather chair that his father had sat in every evening and nursed his tumblers of whiskey. How many nights had he played on that awful rug, careful to avoid his father as he drank and read his medical journals? How many evenings had he come home from school to find his father right there and already drunk as he pretended he could see straight enough to read the Evening Post? He could almost see his father's ghost slumped in that chair now as it turned its head to regard him, its lips peeled back in a too-wide grin. Clive buried the shutter so Gwendolyn wouldn't see it and think less of him. "Are you hungry? I've got dinner ready if you'd like to eat with—" "Not tonight," he said as he gave her a pointed look. "Something's turned my stomach, I'm afraid. I'll be in my study." He walked across the hall, leaving her standing there like a guest who's unsure of where to go. He was operating. His scalpel was a gleaming silver sword as he cut the cheeks of his patient. He cut and cut and cut until the face was one long smile that grinned eternally, even as the patient groaned beyond the haze of anesthesia. He looked up when he was finished, raising his arm to the gallery and finding it filled with the eyeless, smiling creatures. They clapped and capered like Satan's imps, and when he drew off his surgical mask, he could see that he too had a wide, carved grin that dribbled blood onto the sterile floor of his theater. The monstrosities clapped and clapped, and their laughter rang out hollowly through the theater, devoid of all mirth or joy. They laughed without knowing joy, and he reveled in their regard. The thunder outside woke him suddenly, and he sat up in bed. He was breathing heavily, the dream having rattled him, and the rain had started coming down some time after he'd gone to bed. He had kissed Gwendolyn dutifully good night, and gone to what had once been his marital bed. Now he slept there alone, her banished to a guest room until she was ready to make herself clean before God and confess her sins before Father McCormick. She said she wouldn't. It was no one's business but hers and God's, and Clive had rejected her, frankly, secular outlook on what was a shameful practice. The lightning made him jump, and when he looked at the window, he nearly screamed. Outside was one of the grinning abominations, clawed hands splayed against the glass, and rain dripping down his eyeless face. Clive stared at it, his heart feeling ready to leap up out of his chest, and the creature stared eyelessly back at him. The two stood in silence for a count of 30, before a bright flash of lightning dispelled it. When his eyes adjusted, it was as though it had never been there. Clive looked a mess as he came into the hospital the next morning. His scrubs were immaculate as always, but he hadn't had time to press his lab coat. His graying hair sprang up in cowlicks, and he was jumpy after a night spent with the eyeless creatures gazing at him. Every time he had managed to doze off again, he found himself back in that demonic operating theater, the gallery full of those waiting ghouls. He smiled at them in the dream and reveled in their regard, but beneath that facade, he was screaming. He woke up screaming more than once. Gwendolyn never came to check on him. She had likely taken a sleep aid and was catatonic in her bed. He had slept through his 6 a.m. alarm, and when he had come awake with the sun beating on his face, he had thrown himself out of bed in a blind fury. Now it was 9, and he was hours late for his rounds. Nurse Breacher was coming out of the elevator as he was getting ready to go up, and she seemed relieved to see him. "Doc, thank God. We were getting worried about you. Your 10:15 has been moved up to 9:15. They need the operating room at noon for some procedure with Dr. Steiner. Did you know he's been given authorization to use the operating room?" Clive climbed into the elevator beside her and pushed the button going down instead of up. He said as much yesterday. Nurse Breacher looked at him out of the corner of her eye as the elevator rumbled to the ground floor where the operating rooms were. You don't look so good, Doc. Are you okay?" "I had a rough night," he said, stepping out of the doors as they came open. The last thing he wanted to do was step into that operating theater that he had spent most of last night in, but the room was his domain, and he'd be damned before he'd let Steiner or those faceless boogeymen take it from him. Those words would prove prophetic. He hung up his lab coat, telling Nurse Beecher to get everything ready for his gastric debridement, and set about washing his hands. He spoke the words as he always did, a prayer to God to make his hands steady and his mind clear. But the words were muddled as that canned laughter from those creatures swept across his mind. He tried to dispel them, tried to exorcise them from his thoughts, but they just wouldn't go. He felt himself begin to cry, his tears falling into the sink as the warm water and soap ran to join them. He had gotten control of himself by the time Nurse Beecher returned. "They're ready for you, Doc," she said. He strode into the operating room and cast his eyes skyward. But the day was overcast, and it appeared that there would be no transplendent manna from heaven today. His eyes fell upon the gallery instead, and he sucked in a nervous breath as he saw them. Not the creatures, of course, but Snyder and Merkel and their dear sainted Mr. Mason were all sitting up there with a handful of guests and staff on break. They sat on high like a jury from God, judging him, trying to catch him slipping. He straightened himself and set his mind to rights. God's instrument did not slip. He made sure the patient was ready, a 55-year-old with a GI tract full of tumors, and began his first incision. He had opened the chest cavity, the room as silent as a church, when someone in the gallery laughed. Clive paused, almost dropping his instrument had it not been for the textured surgical gloves he wore, and put it out of his mind. The second chortle was worse. It sounded like fake laughter, like sitcom laughter, like the sitcoms Gwendolyn watched in the den sometimes that never appealed to him. He called for silence in the operating room and was elbow deep in the patient's abdomen when he heard the second laugh, a mirthless chuckle that rolled through the gallery like a dead leaf that sent his nerves skittering. "I said quiet in the gallery. If anyone else makes noise, I would like them..." But that's when Nurse Beecher suddenly started laughing. The woman doubled over, her face pressing against the unconscious patient, and sprayed laughter as the gallery rumbled above him. He looked up then, getting ready to yell at them, administrators or not, but he dropped his instrument and gaped at the assembled crowd. Steiner, Merkel, Mason, and numerous others were laughing like loons as the dark creature sat patiently amongst them. One of the nurses, who had come on her break, suddenly leaned out over the rail and fell to the polished tiles below. She burst like an overripe fruit, dousing the machines and instruments in gore and sending the other nurses in the room into gales of laughter. Clive backed away, his breath hitching as their laughter became more and more mechanical. They lost that rosy laughter, their human mirth drained from them as they laughed their lives away. The laughter echoed off the walls, bouncing against the glass ceiling and ringing eerily throughout the operating theater. Clive put his hands to his ears, reminded of the time they had went to a mental hospital when he was in med school. The inmates had laughed just like that, laughing despite the horrors they lived in daily, and Clive had heard that laughter in his nightmares for weeks after. It was the laughter of the clinically insane. It was the laughter of those trapped in hell. Then the man on the table sat up, his guts spilling out as he chuckled and laughed, and Clive felt his bladder let loose as he turned to run. He made it to the wash-up room, his hip striking the sink and sending him spilling. But when he tried to push the door open, it wouldn't budge. He threw his body at it, his hip aching when he hit it, but the door would open for nothing. Clive finally slid down the unmoving portal and sat with his back to it, watching the shadows of those imps coming for him through the foggy glass of the doors beyond. He began to pray, hoping God would show him mercy. Maybe God even did. Who's to speculate on the merciful nature of God, after all? The room was dark. the smoke clouds wafting up to obscure the overheads that made the man's shiny face all the more noticeable. He was sweating heavily, stammering out the last few minutes of his set as he told the crowd about an incident with his mother when he was 12. The audience, stoners, hipsters who'd been drinking since noon, watched him like a bug under a microscope. They wanted to be interested in what he was saying, but really, they were just hoping he would burn up in the harsh overhead lights. At the end of the day, there's nothing better than watching a comedian crash spectacularly. I took a swig of my lukewarm beer and made notes in my notebook. I'd been doing comedy for about a year, and doing comedy is a lot like Alcoholics Anonymous. The guys who have been doing it longer than you are always super smug about it, and they have 1,000 different sayings. They just tell you to keep working the program, no matter how much you hate it. In this case, the program was a 15-minute set. Randy, a 5-year vet of the stage, had found me doing stand-up at my college. He said I had some chops, but suggested that I work on my 15-minute set until I knew it backwards and forwards. Once you know that set better than you know your own hand, then you can start adding new stuff. 6 months later, I'd been doing the same set for 6 months without fail. I felt that I knew it well. I could have quoted it in my sleep, and I had tried to add some new material from time to time. The bits were snappy, the one-liners were delivered perfectly, and Randy had even said that some of my new stuff was good, though off script. I felt that my bits were topical, without being inflammatory, and that my stories landed without being too long-winded. I wasn't ready for Comedy Central, but I was more than prepared for the little dive bars that seemed to be where I was cutting my teeth. So, why was I only receiving middling laughs? The guy on stage, I hadn't bothered to learn his name, stumbled off the stage to some polite, if not strained, applause. He flopped onto the couch next to me, wiping the sweat off his forehead. Randy took the mic and started attempting to get the crowd excited for the next comedian. Randy was usually the MC of these events. His reputation had been made over a half a decade of funny, and the crowd was always glad to see him. He was building me up, getting the crowd hyped for my set, and as he introduced me, I stood up to scattered applause and made my way to the stage. I mounted the stage, a beer in one hand and my notebook in the other, and I set up for the crowd as they murmured and coughed. I adjusted the mic, dropping it a little for Randy's 7-foot-tall height, and the audience seemed to find this amusing. I could see many familiar faces sitting amongst the smoke, and smelled the cheap beer aroma of whatever was on tap. The audience was almost always the same barflies and regulars who came to hear the same jokes repeatedly. I was always happy to see them, and their tip money at the end of the night, but I remember wishing for some new blood amongst the spattering of drunks and stoners. Oh, how God mocked me with his answer. So I'm pro-gun, hold your booze. A few half-hearted boos came from the crowd as though in answer. Someone online asked me the other day if that meant I would shoot a home invader, which it does, but as a comedian who works for tips, I don't usually have anything worth stealing, so it's not usually a problem. Some scattered laughs followed this. Well, they always followed up by asking, "What, don't you value human life more than things?" Well, I tell them, clearly he valued my things more than his life, so I must have nicer shit than I thought. Some half-hearted laughs greeted the end of my joke, but they were perfunctory at best. The crowd came in just as I was setting up the next joke. Have you heard of this guy that makes paper out of elephant dung? Yeah, I shit you not. They take the dung, clean it, press it, clean it again, I hope, and, through a process known only to the paper maker, they create an eco-friendly paper that's safe for the environment. The crowd shuffled in as I set up my punchline, and though I couldn't tell exactly how many there were, it looked like at least 20 people as they filed into the back of the room. I couldn't tell if they sat down or not. The room seemed to get darker as they filled the space. They didn't fill in the empty spaces left by the sparse crowd. They just kind of hovered near the back of the room, in a cloud of strange silence. I realized I had paused a moment too long, and was stretching my punchline out before I continued. But it's like they say, isn't it? One elephant's crap is another man's 50 Shades of Grey. The crowd actually laughed at that one. This joke was so ridiculous that it never failed to get laughs. The group in the back, however, burst into sudden and immediate laughter. The laughter was welcome, but a little unexpected. It was hearty, almost manufactured, and it rolled out in a jolly wave that seemed to take some people by surprise. I saw people in the front jump a little as 20 or so people burst into spontaneous laughter, and I smiled a little, nodding and asking if they liked that joke or something, before continuing on with my next one. The crowd of newcomers were definitely what we needed around here, and I rode the wave of their laughter into my next bit. You ever wonder why you never see any hipster necrophiliacs? The front row shook their head, but the back continued to laugh mechanically, because they'd have to screw them before they get cool. The laughs from the front were more akin to groans as they accepted the corny joke, but the back of the house burst into the same mechanical laughter they had before. I was energized. I was pumped. I was receiving what I thought was my due at long last. These people were eating up what I was putting down, and it tempted me to do something I'd been working on, but just hadn't brought out yet. So my mom called the other day, and the crowd in the back hadn't stopped laughing at me. They buzzed with this sort of constant canned laughter as the others died down and waited for the next joke. Some had turned to look at the crowd behind them, and I could see some of the other comedians looking at them with misgivings. Their laughter never changed, never rose or fell in volume, but kept chuckling out in that fake sitcom laughter you always hear on Friends or How I Met Your Mother. She lives in a small town, 2 stoplights and a Walmart, and the town has a dog that's become a sort of... I was starting to lose my focus as the crowd kept laughing. They never tired, never stopped, and I could see one of the comedians getting up to say something. The audience wasn't watching me anymore. They were all craning around in their seats, looking at the crowd that chuckled on and on. The comedian, it was Mark for sure, walked towards the back. As he did, he was suddenly obscured by the smoky darkness that seemed unaffected by the murky overheads that flanked the stage. He stopped on the fringes, saying something to them as they laughed in response. He suddenly clapped his knees and began to bray that donkey laughter I had heard from the stage on many occasions. He laughed long and hard, joining the throng as his brays were lost amongst the grating mirth. After a few seconds, his unique sound was lost amongst their glee. Town mascot, I continued as I tried to power through it. It sleeps in the middle of the road. People feed it and leave it water. They drive around it and bring it inside at night, and everybody knows who he is and why he's there. I was losing focus. I could see Randy approaching the stage, plugging in a mic so we could remind the crowd to keep it down and respect the comedians. And I hoped that this was just some kind of prank. The laughter had been going for nearly 2 minutes now, and it was becoming abrasive. It was no longer flattering. I was no longer heartened by the laughter. I was becoming creeped out, and if this was someone's idea of a joke, it wasn't very funny. I heard the static when Randy's mic slipped in. Okay, people, let's remember to respect the comedians and keep our laughter to a respectable level, okay? The laughter continued, uninterrupted. I stood on the raised stage, looking out into the inky blackness and watching the chuckling tide. They rumbled out their artificial laughter in the face of my confusion, Randy standing by the stage, glaring at them. When he sat the mic down, I could hear the reverb as it made an angry sound. He set off for the back of the house then, not a particularly long walk, but he didn't seem to want to make it. When he got to the throng of people, he started shouting at them to be quiet. Randy had come to the same conclusion I had. He thought this was a big joke, a flash mob, or maybe even something set up by Mark, and he was not amused. I watched from the stage as his shouts became confused chuckles, his chuckles becoming guffaws, and then it was all over for poor Randy. He stumbled into the mob, grinning and laughing, and his laughs were soon consumed by that tide of laughter. That's when they started moving forward. The crowd was up now, scenting danger, but the strained group blocked the exit. They could do little but watch as the shuffling mass crept forward. They seemed to float as they came, sweeping slowly towards the crowd that had congregated near the stage. Some drunk let fly with a pitcher of PBR, the pitcher spilling as it flew end over end, but if the crowd was slowed by the beer or the heavy glass vessel, they didn't show it. Other men charged them, meaty fists raised, but fell to their knees, laughing before connecting with anything. The group rolled over them, and when they passed, there was no longer anyone on the ground. The closer they got, the less I felt like I saw any of them. As the barflies began to chuckle, their knees shaking and their fists pounding their chests, the more my feet began to drive me towards the back of the stage. The group was made of human-shaped creatures. Their features were dark and undulating, their mouths laughing, white teeth smiling as their eyeless faces bobbed with mirthless laughter. Those who were absorbed by them were never seen again. Those who were absorbed by them never stopped laughing. When my back smacked against the wall, I knew I was out of places to retreat. The fabric curtain that covered that wall felt soft under my sweaty hands, and it was only then that I realized I was still holding the mic. I let it drop, the feedback yarking angrily, but I hardly noticed amidst the din of emotionless laughter. The tone never rose, never fell, just remained at the same level of soulless noise as it drove ice picks into my skull. I closed my eyes, sinking to my backside and covering my ears with my hands as the mask came up to the edge of the stage. When the overhead light hit it, the mask recoiled, and the laughter sounded like tortured screams with a thin veneer of hilarity. It sounded like the laughter that comes creeping out of the windows of an insane asylum. It sounded like the laughter one hears in hell. I closed my eyes and prepared to be consumed. I knew that I, too, would begin to laugh any minute. I would be hopeless to resist. I would simply start to chuckle, start to guffaw, and before I knew it, I would be running to them. I would gladly join the throngs of laughing fools if it meant an end to this hell. I was standing alone outside the joke, and even now in my terror, I longed to be part of it. I don't know how long I sat there with my hands over my ears. One minute the world was a sea of robotic laughter. The next, it was simply gone. I lifted my head to find the bar's back room completely empty. The other three comedians, Mark, Randy, the audience, they were all gone. I was the only one left, the only one not laughing. And when I left the bar, the owner watched me go with some confusion. I never came back again. I knew I couldn't stand on that stage, not after what I had seen, and I certainly couldn't tell jokes again as I thought about the grinning audience of living darkness. Turns out, that was the first of many retreats that night. Over the next few weeks, I saw the audience again and again. They were in the grocery store as I checked out. They were outside the bus as I rode it to work, standing outside the bus stop and looking at me with their eyeless faces. The night they were at the foot of my bed, I knew I had to leave. I packed up everything that mattered to me, got in my car, and drove until I ran out of miles or ran out of money. Turns out, the money came first. I ran out of gas next to a little motel that needed a desk clerk. I've been handling that desk for the last 2 years. I'm pretty good at my job. I make the guests laugh. I'm always at work on time since I live on the premises, and I can eat anything I want from the hotel kitchen as long as I don't go too crazy. I found friends in this little town. Not the same as the ones I had, but they're good people. They tell me often that I should be a comedian. I tell them that in another life, I was. When I go to sleep, I get to live that other life and listen to the chuckling crowd as it drags itself closer and closer to my stage. I always wake up before they get me. I hope they never do.
Mr. Carlson, they want you on stage, sir.
Roger Carlson looked up from his reflection in the mirror and turned to look at the young woman in the doorway. "How do I look?" he asked, smiling hugely as he fixed her with his regard. She flushed a little. "You look great, Mr. Carlson. I was hoping I could get an autograph, if it's not too much to ask." The young woman looked flushed as she held out the paper. Roger grinned as he took it, scrolling his name across the front before handing it back to her. She took it shyly, sliding a lock of brown hair behind her ear. Another fan, of course, but Roger was used to them by now. He'd been signing autographs for the last 10 years, but this was the first one that he had actually earned. No more raunchy Roger, or audience of drunken frat boys. He was done with that now. All of that was behind him. Maybe now he could bask in the light of honest fans who weren't just here for the juvenile humor. Maybe now he could do some serious work, something they would take seriously. "So, what'd you think of the movie?" "Oh, it was okay. I've been a fan of you for a while, though. I used to love your stand-up." That took him back a little. The general consensus from female viewers had always been pretty negative. Raunchy Roger had been beloved by stoners and drunks, and his humor had followed suit pretty well. The character had been great when he'd been doing stand-up, and it had followed him through the last 7 years as the studio he worked for pumped out dumb movie after dumb movie. Raunchy Roger Goes to College, Raunchy Roger Private Eye, Raunchy Roger and the Booby Trap, on and on and on. He wasn't used to girls telling him they liked his work. She looked like she wanted to say more, but at that moment the band picked up and she flushed, looking a little flustered. "I think they're playing you on. Knock 'em dead," she said. Roger gave her a wink and walked towards the stage. The crowd erupted into applause as he came out, and Roger basked in the warm regard as he walked towards the couch. The manager had been adamant about him doing this talk show circuit. Guy David was his first stop, and if he made a good impression here, he could keep making the rounds and pumping his new movie. This was no Raunchy Roger flick either. He had starred in a serious movie for once, and he needed it to do well. He desperately needed to move out from under the shadow of Raunchy Roger. Guy came out to shake his hand, and as he sat, he heard a chorus of male voices yelling, "Raunchy Roger!" from the back row. He gave them a polite wave and turned his attention to Guy. "Here on my couch tonight, we have a real legend in the world of comedy. Raunchy Roger himself, Roger Carlson, everybody." The applause were twinged with some boos this time, but Roger felt it was the same level of appreciation as before. "Thanks, Guy. It's a pleasure to be here." "So you went from starring in a series of B-list movies that appealed to college kids and habitual drunks to starring in a major box office smash. What's that like, Roger?" Guy's teeth gleamed whitely in the overheads, and Roger felt almost blinded. Guy wore the same dark blue suit he always did. His graying hair swooped back in one of those Johnny Carson imitation doos that he had worn since the first show. Guy was a relic. He had been on his show since the late 70s, and he showed no signs of going anywhere. Roger imagined that there was probably a girl or two in the wings getting ready to snipe his career, but maybe she would wait until he was done with his interview if he was lucky. "It's been an amazing ride, Guy, to go from doing something like Raunchy Roger to starring in a big Hollywood picture like Carter's Promise. The crew I worked with was amazing, and it was an honor to work with the beautiful Margot Thames." A wolf whistle came from the back, and the crowd laughed. "Speaking of Miss Thames, you two appear to have some real chemistry on screen. Anything there with you two?" The crowd made some oohing noises, but Roger ignored them. "That's called acting, Guy. I can assure you that while Miss Thames is a lovely woman, there is absolutely nothing romantic between us." That had been by design. Roger had been lying in a bathtub in New Mexico last year, mostly filled with his own vomit, and had looked up stuporously to see his agent, Claude, sitting on the toilet, with a long, suffering look and puke drying on his shirt. Roger had been time-traveling again, which was what he called it when he got blackout drunk, and he had been hitting it hard last night. He had come out of his stupor quick enough when Claude had told him that he'd been giving him CPR for the last 10 minutes. That was a wake-up call. "You need to sort yourself out, Roger. I'm tired of hauling your ass out of the fire. I'm your agent, not your mother. The next time you decide to self-destruct, don't drag me down with you." Roger had cried, tears cutting through the grime and puke, and Claude had put a hand on his shoulder. "Let me help you, Raj. Let me help you get out of this loop." Claude had dropped him off at rehab the same day. After 6 months of puking and shaking and going to countless meetings, he felt like he might be getting better. After 6 months, he had been ready to leave and see if he could maintain this new sober life of his. He had made a promise to himself in rehab, a promise that he would do better. Raunchy Roger was not the cause of his problems, but he was a symptom. Raunchy Roger liked to party. Raunchy Roger liked to sleep with anything with a pulse. Raunchy Roger liked to abuse prescription medication. And if he was going to get his life back together, he had to cleave from Raunchy Roger. When Claude had come to him with a script for Carter's Promise, he had made it clear that he couldn't Roger up the set. Rogering up something was a word Claude had used for ruining it, and Roger had agreed. He had drank nothing stronger than orange juice and water, kept up his workout routine, and put nothing stronger than aspirin in his body since coming out of rehab. A set would have access to the things from his past. Working on a set again would be the real test of his mettle. In the 8 months of shooting, he'd been tempted, but he had not succumbed. He was sitting here now, a better man. This is quite a transition for you, isn't it? From doing something like Raunchy Roger to a serious film like Carter's Promise. Roger realized he'd been wool-gathering and snapped out of it. "It's been quite a change, but a change for the better," he said, smiling out at the crowd. They didn't clap this time, and that seemed a little off-putting. "So, Glenmere Studios hasn't issued any statements on when their next Raunchy Roger movie will come out. Can you give us any insights?" Roger furrowed his brow. Of course, this is why they wanted him here. As far as I know, the series is canceled. The last film will be the end of them. Several people in the audience made displeased noises, but somewhere in the back, someone laughed. It was an odd sound amongst the discomfort, and Roger found himself looking for whoever had made it. He was used to people laughing at him, but it sounded so alien at that moment. It sounded not altogether real. Guy seemed shocked. After all this time? We're talking about a series that's been going on for 7 years. Yes, well, now I'm moving on. I think we can finally put the character to rest. In the low rumbles from the crowd, he heard that laughter again. It was subtle, maybe 1 or 2 people, but it rankled him. He searched again for the source, but couldn't see anything. The house lights were always down when someone was on stage, and it made a murky soup out of the audience. The lights in his eyes didn't help matters either, and he found himself squinting against them. Well, out of respect for the recently deceased, maybe you can give us some classic raunchy Roger lines? Guy asked, looking at the audience who began to clap like a bunch of sheep. Roger felt like screaming. Claude had told him this interview was all about the new movie, not his past. He didn't even want to think back on those drunken days when Roger had ruled his life, but it seemed to be all anyone wanted. The crowd was actually laughing now, cheering and egging him on, but the grating laughter still lingered amongst them. It was like an ice pick against his temple, that mechanical laughter that skittered through the crowd too fast to be discovered. They quieted down when he didn't laugh along with them, or stand up to oblige. I don't think so, Guy. I'm here to talk about Carter's Promise, not to rehash old material. He tried to ignore that grating chuckle, but it was becoming harder and harder to keep his cool. Oh, come on, just a few bits. What about the priest and the communion wine? I know that always makes me chuckle. How about it, folks? They applauded, but Roger barely heard them. All he could hear were the snickers, the chuckles, those mean little titters from the lips of fools. Look, I appreciate how many of you are fans of Raunchy Roger, but that's not me anymore. That's a part of my life I'm trying to put behind myself. I just want to forget about it and move on to more important things. A chuckle rumbled up from the audience, not altogether the artificial laughter he'd been hearing, and Roger felt his temper flare. I told the studio I wasn't going to do it anymore, okay? I'm a real actor now, he shouted. The back of the house bubbled with canned laughter, and Roger thought he saw people standing up in the back row. Were they smiling? They moved up to the next row, blackness swirling in that tepid sea of shadows that threatened to take in the next row of people. The scowling faces in front of them seemed to melt into smiles, their sudden laughter joining the rising din from the back of the house. They were laughing. They were laughing at him. Roger had been laughed at all of his life, but this was the first time it truly made him furious. I'm glad I did it too. I killed Raunchy Roger. He was made of the worst, darkest parts of me, and I'm glad he's dead, Roger shouted at the crowd, rising up from the couch and stalking towards them. He balled up his fists. They couldn't come and hear about his new project. They all had to pick the meat off the carcass of his old work. They wanted to hear the joke about the lesbian sisters, the nun who moonlighted as a dominatrix, the menacing priest he had barely escaped in his youth, and all those Raunchy Roger classics that had transcended his stand-up and made it onto screen. Roger, you maybe should calm down a little. I'm not doing it anymore. Do you hear me? I'm not dancing for your amusement. Raunchy Roger was a misogynistic prick, a cancer that had to be removed. I'm a better person now. The crowd erupted into a flurry of canned laughter. They were really laughing at him now. They were mocking his suffering. They were mocking his journey. He had escaped a life that meant to kill him, and these assholes were mocking him. They didn't have the slightest idea what it was like to live under the shadow of Raunchy Roger. They didn't have a clue what it felt like to step out from under that weight. I'm a real actor, he screamed, not some clown that struts about to make you laugh at his antics. I moved on. Maybe you should move on too. But the closer he got to the crowd, the more he noticed them change. The blackness tore through them like a disease, and what had begun in the back was now rioting through the middle and working its way to the stage. The crowd, buried in that hazy blackness, grinned at him with 2 wide smiles and 2 white teeth. They leered at him, jumping seats and coming forward in a horror movie shuffle of propelled bodies. Roger backed away a step, almost tripping on the rug that stretched over the stage. He could hear the canned laughter ripping through the whole studio, and one of the band members began to chortle even as Roger backed away. The chortler fell over suddenly, his drum set falling with him, and he convulsed as the laughter was ripped from him and became the same mirthless screech that ran through the crowd. Guy began to giggle behind his desk, the laughter bubbling up painfully as Roger turned to run. The tide of laughter oozed behind him, and he ran for the exit door as fast as he could. He bumped into the pretty receptionist who had wished him luck, already doubling over as her skin began to mottle and run, and Roger felt fear move his feet as he charged for the door. He hit it like a fullback, but bounced off as the door refused to open. He slammed into them again and again, but they wouldn't budge. He turned, running down the hall for the side door, but the laughter was already coming up that way too. He was trapped. He had nowhere to go. He had to get out of here, and he saw the broom closet and dived inside. He sat amongst the mops and cleaning implements, his back against the wall, with a mop handle stuck under the door to keep it shut. Outside, he could hear things moving, hear their laughter as they got closer and closer. He dug his phone out and tried 911. He had to get some help. Someone would surely come to help him. The number rang, and after 12 rings, Roger hung up. He called the police, called the fire department, and finally called his manager, Claude. Claude picked up on the third ring. "Roger, what's wrong? You're supposed to be on stage." "Claude, something's going on in the studio. People are trying to attack me. I need help. He trailed off. What did he need? "You? Who would be trying to attack you? You're Raunchy Roger," he said, laughing a little as he said it. "Everyone loves you. Why would anyone care enough to hurt someone like you?" He broke into laughs between every word, his laughter cutting and jagged as it seemed to tear his throat apart with its intensity. He howled like a beast on the other end of the phone, and Roger could imagine him gasping his sides as he laughed his life away, on and on. His laughter sounded like the lunatic chorus you hear out the asylum window. It sounded like the laughter Roger imagined you'd hear in hell. The voice that came back on the phone was very different. It was liquid, oily, but still recognizable. It was a voice he knew as well as his own. How many times had he cultivated it on stage? How many nights had he talked to himself in just that voice? Roger found himself talking to Raunchy Roger, and the realization made him shudder. "Why would anyone care if you lived or died, you stupid hack? They all want me, Raunchy Roger. No one gives a crap about whatever little movie you're managing to spew out. You might as well come out and embrace it, bucko. I'm not going anywhere." His voice was backlit, overpowered, drowned out by the laughter that suddenly bubbled up from the phone, and Roger sat against the wall as the laughter on the phone matched the laughter approaching the door. He suddenly snorted and covered his face with his hands. He couldn't help it. Something about this situation was suddenly just so damn funny. "Be advised, ye who enter here." The crowd had been buzzing like a swarm of anxious insects, but as the deep, resonant voice spilled over them, they quieted. "This is a horror fiction live show." The crowd was a-twitter with restless legs and barely contained whispers. The venue, an old playhouse that stood for another few days, was the perfect locale for this year's Halloween show. The building had a rich history of hauntings, strange activity, and a dark past that would make the ambience all the spookier. Shelley was happy that they had secured the place. The owner had seemed surprised that she wanted to use it, and they had taken relatively little to rent it. As Tobias sat on stage, Cindy on his left and Lucius on his right, the crowd sat anxiously before them. Shelley knew this was going to be a show to remember. Those with weak constitutions or questionable mental states should be advised to proceed at their own risk. The crowd began to cheer, and Shelley saw a runner of dust shifting from the rafters. Hopefully this old place wouldn't collapse in on them. You have been warned. To those who remain, brace yourself for the Sleepless Nights Horror Podcast. The applause were deafening, and Shelley knew there would be some serious editing in post to make sure that it was usable. She saw some trails of dust wafting from the ceiling as the cheers escalated, and thought about how the structural integrity of this place was likely to be poor. They had placed 500 of the show's closest fans in the rickety seats in the main showroom, and the gas lamps lit the scene in a ghostly way that couldn't be fabricated. The chandelier overhead was lit by 1,000 real candles, the effort of an hour or more, but it cast the second glow over the room that would only add to the ambience. "Make sure you keep a steady shot over the crowd," she told the cameraman quietly, and he gave her a thumbs up as he swept the crowd. When the network saw this, it would be impossible for them to refuse their proposal. The Sleepless Nights Horror Podcast was the third most popular horror podcast on Stitcher, the fifth most listened to on Spotify, and had over 1 million fans worldwide. The show had been steadily rising in the ranks, but its numbers had stagnated a few months ago. People were only so interested in scary story podcasts, and the production team had been looking for ways to boost the listeners. They had tried the usual hooks, giveaways, collaborations, longer episodes, but nothing seemed to be working. That was when Creepshow had approached them. Creepshow was an online network that streamed horror content and provided a platform for horror creators. They had been turned down by other narrators and had finally come to see if they could secure the voice and story talent of the Sleepless Nights Horror Podcast. They had wanted a test tape, something they could send to their backers to prove the show belonged on the network. Thus, here they were, shooting a Halloween episode in this abandoned theater. The showing had been good, 500 screaming fans, and Tobias's sultry voice moving among them like a cloud of death, infecting them all with excitement. Welcome to the show, folks. I'm your host, Tobias Mons, and I'd like to thank you for joining us tonight. If you're listening from home, then let me just say you're missing a truly creepy experience. We're coming to you live from the Sheridan Theater. This theater has played host to not only many of the greatest musical talents of the last 30 years, but also a host of grisly murders and suicide. The blood has run thick between the boards of this old building, and where better to tell our spooky tales tonight than right here? The audience quieted, settling in for the start of the show. The cameras panned over the crowd of expectant 20-somethings as they spoke in a hush. Shelley glanced over the crowd and had to do a double take when she saw someone standing in the center aisle. She was a lithe little thing, wearing something like a zombie costume, walking up the center stage. Her long, dark hair swayed as she came, and Shelby couldn't help but sigh as she thought, "Crazed fan." Shelby got on the radio to call security to intercept her, but when she glanced back, the girl was gone. Shelley scanned the crowd and found that no one even looked close to the way the girl had. She put it out of her mind as Tobias started his first story. Our first tale is about a man with a dream. He wants to be a ventriloquist, but the dummy he finds is anything but helpful. Submitted for your approval, I give you Wooden Nickel. As he began the story about a possessed puppet, Shelby looked down at the camera display sitting before her. The booth was set up in one of the balconies that overlooked the stage and seats. Each of the other balconies held cameras that caught the scene below from a different angle, and by the end they would have 3 or 4 different views of the stage. They would edit everything together later, and the results would give them something cool to send to Creepshow. As she watched the camera feeds, one of the upper balcony lights began to wink, casting a flickering eyesore over the stage. Shelley glanced at the upper balcony and saw the can flickering as it hung from the railing. She had the walkie to her lips, trying to route someone up there, when she saw a murky shadow skulking up on the landing in the inky blackness. What the hell was going on up there? Those landings were supposed to be closed off. Some rogue fan would ruin this taping for them, and she took off for the stairs to see who was mucking around. When she found the padlock still on the door, however, Shelley wrinkled her brow and hesitated as she took it off. When she found the balcony empty, Shelley left in a hurry, locking the door behind her. She came back down to a shouting match in the hallway. Derek was the senior camera tech for the troupe. He was a big guy with a bushy beard and a cap snugged down over his graying hair, and he had been with the show for a while. He was yelling at Cecily, the stage manager, and she came back in time to hear him saying that he was going to leave, and she couldn't stop him. Cecily was in tears. Tears were usually not far from her, and she begged him not to go. Who would run the board? Who would maintain the feeds? I don't care. I told you yesterday this job wasn't worth my life." Ah, yes, yesterday. They had been setting up all day yesterday, trying to get the wiring in the old theater to cooperate. The old theater had never been intended to run the equipment they were bringing in, and they had run the cables from the van and started setting up nonetheless. Everyone knew the place had a reputation for spooks. It was supposed to be one of the most haunted places in the city. By the end of the day, everyone in the troupe found out it was well earned, too. It started as things seen out of the corner of the eye. They were things easily ignored, until later, when you had time to think about it. Derek had seen something, too, and he told Paul and Mark to help him search the building earlier that day. "It could be a homeless guy," he said, "and we don't want to be jumped on by some meth head while our backs are turned." They spent the first hour searching the building, from attic to basement, but found nothing but an angry cat and some wasps in the rafters. When they gave the crew the all clear, those who hadn't searched milling about the alley next to the theater, everyone got back to work. Shelley would still catch things out of the corner of her eye, though. Shadows, slight movements, but she brushed it all off as nerves. She had grown up hearing stories about this place, and it was only natural that she would be a little nervous here. When they broke for lunch, Paul had already been talking about seeing someone on the theater floor. Everyone told him he was nuts, but he was adamant that he had seen someone down there. "I was hanging lights in one of the balconies, and when I looked down, I saw this woman walking towards the stage. She was holding her stomach, staggering like a drunk, but before I could call out to her, she just disappeared." They brushed it off, saying the dust or the lights were playing tricks on him, but after what Shelley had seen earlier, she couldn't help but wonder. Derek's accident had happened near dark. Shelley had been setting up the stage when she heard a loud crash and Derek's bear-like yell. He had fallen into the railing on one of the boxes, the rail cracking and threatening to spill him. He was breathing heavily and looking around frantically as Shelley stood looking at him. He seemed unable to push off the rail, unwilling, and wouldn't move until Shelley and Mark came up there to get him. He was sitting then, shuddering and looking furtively around. He looked terrified. "What happened?" Shelley asked, and when she tried to touch him, he shuddered away from her. "Someone tried to attack me," he stammered, pointing to the shadow area behind the door of the box. "I turned to leave after setting up the cameras, and it was just standing there on the balcony. I thought it was one of you at first, but it weren't right. It was like a person made out of shadows. It was wearing a suit and a hat, smiling this huge, horrible grin. And then it laughed. It burst out of it, and it came towards me. Its laughter sounded like the roar of a wildcat, and when it opened that smiling mouth to try to eat me, I almost fell through the railing as I backed away. When I looked back, I was scared it was going to bite my face, but it was gone." He wouldn't go back in after that. He left for the day, and the three of them had to finish the preparations. It was good and dark by the time they were done, and they were all glad to be gone. None of them had seen any of those inky monsters that he talked about, but they had all seen some weird stuff out of sight. Paul had lost his cell phone, too. He had laid it down on a banister and turned to find it gone. He had given it up as lost, only to find it sitting on the front stoop when they left. Mark swore that he had been pushed, almost tumbling down the stairs, but said it could have just as easily been a loose board as a ghostly hand. Nothing too weird had happened to Shelley, but she made a mental note not to be here by herself. This place just had an aura about it, an aura that was still working on Derek, it seemed. Shelley stepped into the conversation just as Derek was about to storm past Cecily. "What is going on? You two are yelling much too close to the cameras." "I saw it," Derek said, shuddering as Cecily looked blankly at him. Cecily may not have known what he was talking about, but Shelley found herself glancing around. "Where?" "Upper balcony. I saw the lights flashing and looked up to see what the problem was. I saw it up there, staring down at me and smiling. It stared at me for nearly 2 minutes before it just melted away like mist." Shelley shuddered without meaning to. He was describing the balcony that she had been on not 5 minutes ago. "Derek, I need you to go back to your post." Derek bristled. "The hell I will! That thing tried to kill me yesterday, and if tonight goes off without a hitch, none of us will ever need to worry about this kind of crap again. This is a stunt, Derek, a grand gesture to show the network that we mean business. We have an hour left, maybe an hour 30, and we're out the door. I need you to keep it together for that long. Can you do that?" Derek stared at her icily, but finally nodded. "For the show," he breathed. He turned and left Cecily and Shelley standing in the hallway. "What's he talking about?" Cecily asked, completely lost. "He had a bad experience last night. Stay with him, please," Shelley begged, wanting this to go well. Cecily nodded and went to keep Derek company. Shelley went back to the control booth. She came in just as the story reached its midpoint, and the audience was making appreciative noises. Tobias's voice rolled. He turned and left Cecily and Shelley standing in the hallway. "What's he talking about?" Cecily asked, completely lost. "He had a bad experience last night. Stay with him, please," Shelley begged, wanting this to go well. Cecily nodded and went to keep Derek company. Shelley went back to the control booth. She came in just as the story reached its midpoint, and the audience was making appreciative noises. Tobias's voice rolled. He turned and left Cecily and Shelley standing in the hallway. "What's he talking about?" Cecily asked, completely lost. "He had a bad experience last night. Stay with him, please," Shelley begged, wanting this to go well. Cecily nodded and went to keep Derek company. Shelley went back to the control booth. She came in just as the story reached its midpoint, and the audience was making appreciative noises. Tobias's voice rolled. He turned and left Cecily and Shelley standing in the hallway. "What's he talking about?" Cecily asked, completely lost. "He had a bad experience last night. Stay with him, please," Shelley begged, wanting this to go well. Cecily nodded and went to keep Derek company. Shelley went back to the control booth. She came in just as the story reached its midpoint, and the audience was making appreciative noises. Tobias's voice rolled. He turned and left Cecily and Shelley standing in the hallway. "What's he talking about?" Cecily asked, completely lost. "He had a bad experience last night. Stay with him, please," Shelley begged, wanting this to go well. Cecily nodded and went to keep Derek company. Shelley went back to the control booth. She came in just as the story reached its midpoint, and the audience was making appreciative noises. Tobias's voice rolled. He turned and left Cecily and Shelley standing in the hallway. "What's he talking about?" Cecily asked, completely lost. "He had a bad experience last night. Stay with him, please," Shelley begged, wanting this to go well. Cecily nodded and went to keep Derek company. Shelley went back to the control booth. She came in just as the story reached its midpoint, and the audience was making appreciative noises. Tobias's voice rolled. He turned and left Cecily and Shelley standing in the hallway. "What's he talking about?" Cecily asked, completely lost. "He had a bad experience last night. Stay with him, please," Shelley begged, wanting this to go well. Cecily nodded and went to keep Derek company. Shelley went back to the control booth. She came in just as the story reached its midpoint, and the audience was making appreciative noises. Tobias's voice rolled. He turned and left Cecily and Shelley standing in the hallway. "What's he talking about?" Cecily asked, completely lost. "He had a bad experience last night. Stay with him, please," Shelley begged, wanting this to go well. Cecily nodded and went to keep Derek company. Shelley went back to the control booth. She came in just as the story reached its midpoint, and the audience was making appreciative noises. Tobias's voice rolled. He turned and left Cecily and Shelley standing in the hallway. "What's he talking about?" Cecily asked, completely lost. "He had a bad experience last night. Stay with him, please," Shelley begged, wanting this to go well. Cecily nodded and went to keep Derek company. Shelley went back to the control booth. She came in just as the story reached its midpoint, and the audience was making appreciative noises. Tobias's voice rolled. He turned and left Cecily and Shelley standing in the hallway. "What's he talking about?" Cecily asked, completely lost. "He had a bad experience last night. Stay with him, please," Shelley begged, wanting this to go well. Cecily nodded and went to keep Derek company. Shelley went back to the control booth. She came in just as the story reached its midpoint, and the audience was making appreciative noises. Tobias's voice rolled. He turned and left Cecily and Shelley standing in the hallway. "What's he talking about?" Cecily asked, completely lost. "He had a bad experience last night. Stay with him, please," Shelley begged, wanting this to go well. Cecily nodded and went to keep Derek company. Shelley went back to the control booth. She came in just as the story reached its midpoint, and the audience was making appreciative noises. Tobias's voice rolled. He turned and left Cecily and Shelley standing in the hallway. "What's he talking about?" Cecily asked, completely lost. "He had a bad experience last night. Stay with him, please," Shelley begged, wanting this to go well. Cecily nodded and went to keep Derek company. Shelley went back to the control booth. She came in just as the story reached its midpoint, and the audience was making appreciative noises. Tobias's voice rolled. He turned and left Cecily and Shelley standing in the hallway. "What's he talking about?" Cecily asked, completely lost. "He had a bad experience last night. Stay with him, please," Shelley begged, wanting this to go well. Cecily nodded and went to keep Derek company. Shelley went back to the control booth. She came in just as the story reached its midpoint, and the audience was making appreciative noises. Tobias's voice rolled. He turned and left Cecily and Shelley standing in the hallway. "What's he talking about?" Cecily asked, completely lost. "He had a bad experience last night. Stay with him, please," Shelley begged, wanting this to go well. Cecily nodded and went to keep Derek company. Shelley went back to the control booth. She came in just as the story reached its midpoint, and the audience was making appreciative noises. Tobias's voice rolled. He turned and left Cecily and Shelley standing in the hallway. "What's he talking about?" Cecily asked, completely lost. "He had a bad experience last night. Stay with him, please," Shelley begged, wanting this to go well. Cecily nodded and went to keep Derek company. Shelley went back to the control booth. She came in just as the story reached its midpoint, and the audience was making appreciative noises. Tobias's voice rolled. He turned and left Cecily and Shelley standing in the hallway. "What's he talking about?" Cecily asked, completely lost. "He had a bad experience last night. Stay with him, please," Shelley begged, wanting this to go well. Cecily nodded and went to keep Derek company. Shelley went back to the control booth. She came in just as the story reached its midpoint, and the audience was making appreciative noises. Tobias's voice rolled. He turned and left Cecily and Shelley standing in the hallway. "What's he talking about?" Cecily asked, completely lost. "He had a bad experience last night. Stay with him, please," Shelley begged, wanting this to go well. Cecily nodded and went to keep Derek company. Shelley went back to the control booth. She came in just as the story reached its midpoint, and the audience was making appreciative noises. Tobias's voice rolled. He turned and left Cecily and Shelley standing in the hallway. "What's he talking about?" Cecily asked, completely lost. "He had a bad experience last night. Stay with him, please," Shelley begged, wanting this to go well. Cecily nodded and went to keep Derek company. Shelley went back to the control booth. She came in just as the story reached its midpoint, and the audience was making appreciative noises. Tobias's voice rolled. He turned and left Cecily and Shelley standing in the hallway. "What's he talking about?" Cecily asked, completely lost. "He had a bad experience last night. Stay with him, please," Shelley begged, wanting this to go well. Cecily nodded and went to keep Derek company. Shelley went back to the control booth. She came in just as the story reached its midpoint, and the audience was making appreciative noises. Tobias's voice rolled. He turned and left Cecily and Shelley standing in the hallway. "What's he talking about?" Cecily asked, completely lost. "He had a bad experience last night. Stay with him, please," Shelley begged, wanting this to go well. Cecily nodded and went to keep Derek company. Shelley went back to the control booth. She came in just as the story reached its midpoint, and the audience was making appreciative noises. Tobias's voice rolled. He turned and left Cecily and Shelley standing in the hallway. "What's he talking about?" Cecily asked, completely lost. "He had a bad experience last night. Stay with him, please," Shelley begged, wanting this to go well. Cecily nodded and went to keep Derek company. Shelley went back to the control booth. She came in just as the story reached its midpoint, and the audience was making appreciative noises. Tobias's voice rolled. He turned and left Cecily and Shelley standing in the hallway. "What's he talking about?" Cecily asked, completely lost. "He had a bad experience last night. Stay with him, please," Shelley begged, wanting this to go well. Cecily nodded and went to keep Derek company. Shelley went back to the control booth. She came in just as the story reached its midpoint, and the audience was making appreciative noises. Tobias's voice rolled. He turned and left Cecily and Shelley standing in the hallway. "What's he talking about?" Cecily asked, completely lost. "He had a bad experience last night. Stay with him, please," Shelley begged, wanting this to go well. Cecily nodded and went to keep Derek company. Shelley went back to the control booth. She came in just as the story reached its midpoint, and the audience was making appreciative noises. Tobias's voice rolled. He turned and left Cecily and Shelley standing in the hallway. "What's he talking about?" Cecily asked, completely lost. "He had a bad experience last night. Stay with him, please," Shelley begged, wanting this to go well. Cecily nodded and went to keep Derek company. Shelley went back to the control booth. She came in just as the story reached its midpoint, and the audience was making appreciative noises. Tobias's voice rolled. He turned and left Cecily and Shelley standing in the hallway. "What's he talking about?" Cecil asked, completely lost. "He had a bad experience last night. Stay with him, please," Shelley begged, wanting this to go well. Cecily nodded and went to keep Derek company. Shelley went back to the control booth. She came in just as the story reached its midpoint, and the audience was making appreciative noises. Tobias's voice rolled. He turned and left Cecily and Shelley standing in the hallway. "What's he talking about?" Cecily asked, completely lost. "He had a bad experience last night. Stay with him, please," Shelley begged, wanting this to go well. Cecily nodded and went to keep Derek company. Shelley went back to the control booth. She came in just as the story reached its midpoint, and the audience was making appreciative noises. Tobias's voice rolled. He turned and left Cecily and Shelley standing in the hallway. "What's he talking about?" Cecily asked, completely lost. "He had a bad experience last night. Stay with him, please," Shelley begged, wanting this to go well. Cecily nodded and went to keep Derek company. Shelley went back to the control booth. She came in just as the story reached its midpoint, and the audience was making appreciative noises. Tobias's voice rolled. He turned and left Cecily and Shelley standing in the hallway. "What's he talking about?" Cecily asked, completely lost. "He had a bad experience last night. Stay with him, please," Shelley begged, wanting this to go well. Cecily nodded and went to keep Derek company. Shelley went back to the control booth. She came in just as the story reached its midpoint, and the audience was making appreciative noises. Tobias's voice rolled. He turned and left Cecily and Shelley standing in the hallway. "What's he talking about?" Cecily asked, completely lost. "He had a bad experience last night. Stay with him, please," Shelley begged, wanting this to go well. Cecily nodded and went to keep Derek company. Shelley went back to the control booth. She came in just as the story reached its midpoint, and the audience was making appreciative noises. Tobias's voice rolled. He turned and left Cecily and Shelley standing in the hallway. "What's he talking about?" Cecily asked, completely lost. "He had a bad experience last night. Stay with him, please," Shelley begged, wanting this to go well. Cecily nodded and went to keep Derek company. Shelley went back to the control booth. She came in just as the story reached its midpoint, and the audience was making appreciative noises. Tobias's voice rolled. He turned and left Cecily and Shelley standing in the hallway. "What's he talking about?" Cecily asked, completely lost. "He had a bad experience last night. Stay with him, please," Shelley begged, wanting this to go well. Cecily nodded and went to keep Derek company. Shelley went back to the control booth. She came in just as the story reached its midpoint, and the audience was making appreciative noises. Tobias's voice rolled. He turned and left Cecily and Shelley standing in the hallway. "What's he talking about?" Cecily asked, completely lost. "He had a bad experience last night. Stay with him, please," Shelley begged, wanting this to go well. Cecily nodded and went to keep Derek company. Shelley went back to the control booth. She came in just as the story reached its midpoint, and the audience was making appreciative noises. Tobias's voice rolled. He turned and left Cecily and Shelley standing in the hallway. "What's he talking about?" Cecily asked, completely lost. "He had a bad experience last night. Stay with him, please," Shelley begged, wanting this to go well. Cecily nodded and went to keep Derek company. Shelley went back to the control booth. She came in just as the story reached its midpoint, and the audience was making appreciative noises. Tobias's voice rolled. He turned and left Cecily and Shelley standing in the hallway. "What's he talking about?" Cecily asked, completely lost. "He had a bad experience last night. Stay with him, please," Shelley begged, wanting this to go well. Cecily nodded and went to keep Derek company. Shelley went back to the control booth. She came in just as the story reached its midpoint, and the audience was making appreciative noises. Voice rolled. He turned and left Cecily and Shelley standing in the hallway. "What's he talking about?" Cecily asked, completely lost. "He had a bad experience last night. Stay with him, please," Shelley begged, wanting this to go well. Cecily nodded and went to keep Derek company. Shelley went back to the control booth. Tobias's came in just as the story reached its midpoint, and the audience was making appreciative noises. Voice rolled. He turned and left Cecily and Shelley standing in the hallway. "What's he talking about?" Cecily asked, completely lost. "He had a bad experience last night. Stay with him, please," Shelley begged, wanting this to go well. Cecily nodded and went to keep Derek company. Shelley went back to the control booth. Tobias's came in just as the story reached its midpoint, and the audience was making appreciative noises. Voice rolled. He turned and left Cecily and Shelley standing in the hallway. "What's he talking about?" Cecil asked, completely lost. "He had a bad experience last night. Stay with him, please," Shelley begged, wanting this to go well. Cecily nodded and went to keep Derek company. Shelley went back to the control booth. Tobias came in just as the story reached its midpoint, and the audience was making appreciative noises. Voice rolled. He turned and left Cecily and Shelley standing in the hallway. "What's he talking about?" Cecily asked, completely lost. "He had a bad experience last night. Stay with him, please," Shelley begged, wanting this to go well. Cecily nodded and went to keep Derek company. Shelley went back to the control booth. Tobias came in just as the story reached its midpoint, and the audience was making appreciative noises. Voice rolled. He turned and left Cecily and Shelley standing in the hallway. "What's he talking about?" Cecily asked, completely lost. "He had a bad experience last night. Stay with him, please," Shelley begged, wanting this to go well. Cecily nodded and went to keep Derek company. Shelley went back to the control booth. Tobias came in just as the story reached its midpoint, and the audience was making appreciative noises. Voice rolled. He turned and left Cecily and Shelley standing in the hallway. "What's he talking about?" Cecily asked, completely lost. "He had a bad experience last night. Stay with him, please," Shelley begged, wanting this to go well. Cecily nodded and went to keep Derek company. Shelley went back to the control booth. Tobias came in just as the story reached its midpoint, and the audience was making appreciative noises. Voice rolled. He turned and left Cecily and Shelley standing in the hallway. "What's he talking about?" Cecily asked, completely lost. "He had a bad experience last night. Stay with him, please," Shelley begged, wanting this to go well. Cecily nodded and went to keep Derek company. Shelley went back to the control booth. Tobias came in just as the story reached its midpoint, and the audience was making appreciative noises. Voice rolled. He turned and left Cecily and Shelley standing in the hallway. "What's he talking about?" Cecily asked, completely lost. "He had a bad experience last night. Stay with him, please," Shelley begged, wanting this to go well. Cecily nodded and went to keep Derek company. Shelley went back to the control booth. Tobias came in just as the story reached its midpoint, and the audience was making appreciative noises. Voice rolled. He turned and left Cecily and Shelley standing in the hallway. "What's he talking about?" Cecily asked, completely lost. "He had a bad experience last night. Stay with him, please," Shelley begged, wanting this to go well. Cecily nodded and went to keep Derek company. Shelley went back to the control booth. Tobias came in just as the story reached its midpoint, and the audience was making appreciative noises. Voice rolled. He turned and left Cecily and Shelley standing in the hallway. "What's he talking about?" Cecily asked, completely lost. "He had a bad experience last night. Stay with him, please," Shelley begged, wanting this to go well. Cecily nodded and went to keep Derek company. Shelley went back to the control booth. Tobias came in just as the story reached its midpoint, and the audience was making appreciative noises. Voice rolled. He turned and left Cecily and Shelley standing in the hallway. "What's he talking about?" Cecily asked, completely lost. "He had a bad experience last night. Stay with him, please," Shelley begged, wanting this to go well. Cecily nodded and went to keep Derek company. Shelley went back to the control booth. Tobias came in just as the story reached its midpoint, and the audience was making appreciative noises. Voice rolled. He turned and left Cecily and Shelley standing in the hallway. "What's he talking about?" Cecily asked, completely lost. "He had a bad experience last night. Stay with him, please," Shelley begged, wanting this to go well. Cecily nodded and went to keep Derek company. Shelley went back to the control booth. Tobias came in just as the story reached its midpoint, and the audience was making appreciative noises. Voice rolled. He turned and left Cecily and Shelley standing in the hallway. "What's he talking about?" Cecily asked, completely lost. "He had a bad experience last night. Stay with him, please," Shelley begged, wanting this to go well. Cecily nodded and went to keep Derek company. Shelley went back to the control booth. Tobias came in just as the story reached its midpoint, and the audience was making appreciative noises. Voice rolled. He turned and left Cecily and Shelley standing in the hallway. "What's he talking about?" Cecily asked, completely lost. "He had a bad experience last night. Stay with him, please," Shelley begged, wanting this to go well. Cecily nodded and went to keep Derek company. Shelley went back to the control booth. Tobias came in just as the story reached its midpoint, and the audience was making appreciative noises. Voice rolled. He turned and left Cecily and Shelley standing in the hallway. "What's he talking about?" Cecily asked, completely lost. He had a bad experience last night. Stay with him, please, Shelley begged, wanting this to go well. Cecily nodded and went to keep Derek company. Shelley went back to the control booth. Tobias came in just as the story reached its midpoint, and the audience was making appreciative noises. Voice rolled. He turned and left Cecily and Shelley standing in the hallway. "What's he talking about?" Cecily asked, completely lost. "He had a bad experience last night. Stay with him, please," Shelley begged, wanting this to go well. Cecily nodded and went to keep Derek company. Shelley went back to the control booth. Tobias came in just as the story reached its midpoint, and the audience was making appreciative noises. Voice rolled. He turned and left Cecily and Shelley standing in the hallway. "What's he talking about?" Cecily asked, completely lost. "He had a bad experience last night. Stay with him, please," Shelley begged, wanting this to go well. Cecily nodded and went to keep Derek company. Shelley went back to the control booth. Tobias came in just as the story reached its midpoint, and the audience was making appreciative noises. Voice rolled. He turned and left Cecily and Shelley standing in the hallway. "What's he talking about?" Cecily asked, completely lost. "He had a bad experience last night. Stay with him, please," Shelley begged, wanting this to go well. Cecily nodded and went to keep Derek company. Shelley went back to the control booth. Tobias came in just as the story reached its midpoint, and the audience was making appreciative noises. Voice rolled. He turned and left Cecily and Shelley standing in the hallway. "What's he talking about?" Cecily asked, completely lost. "He had a bad experience last night. Stay with him, please," Shelley begged, wanting this to go well. Cecily nodded and went to keep Derek company. Shelley went back to the control booth. Tobias came in just as the story reached its midpoint, and the audience was making appreciative noises. Voice rolled. He turned and left Cecily and Shelley standing in the hallway. "What's he talking about?" Cecily asked, completely lost. "He had a bad experience last night. Stay with him, please," Shelley begged, wanting this to go well. Cecily nodded and went to keep Derek company. Shelley went back to the control booth. Tobias came in just as the story reached its midpoint, and the audience was making appreciative noises. Voice rolled. He turned and left Cecily and Shelley standing in the hallway. "What's he talking about?" Cecily asked, completely lost. "He had a bad experience last night. Stay with him, please," Shelley begged, wanting this to go well. Cecily nodded and went to keep Derek company. Shelley went back to the control booth. Tobias came in just as the story reached its midpoint, and the audience was making appreciative noises. Voice rolled. He turned and left Cecily and Shelley standing in the hallway. "What's he talking about?" Cecily asked, completely lost. "He had a bad experience last night. Stay with him, please," Shelley begged, wanting this to go well. Cecily nodded and went to keep Derek company. Shelley went back to the control booth. Tobias came in just as the story reached its midpoint, and the audience was making appreciative noises. Voice rolled. He turned and left Cecily and Shelley standing in the hallway. "What's he talking about?" Cecily asked, completely lost. "He had a bad experience last night. Stay with him, please," Shelley begged, wanting this to go well. Cecily nodded and went to keep Derek company. Shelley went back to the control booth. Tobias came in just as the story reached its midpoint, and the audience was making appreciative noises. Voice rolled. He turned and left Cecily and Shelley standing in the hallway. "What's he talking about?" Cecily asked, completely lost. "He had a bad experience last night. Stay with him, please," Shelley begged, wanting this to go well. Cecily nodded and went to keep Derek company. Shelley went back to the control booth. Tobias came in just as the story reached its midpoint, and the audience was making appreciative noises. Voice rolled. He turned and left Cecily and Shelley standing in the hallway. "What's he talking about?" Cecily asked, completely lost. "He had a bad experience last night. Stay with him, please," Shelley begged, wanting this to go well. Cecily nodded and went to keep Derek company. Shelley went back to the control booth. Tobias came in just as the story reached its midpoint, and the audience was making appreciative noises. Voice rolled. He turned and left Cecily and Shelley standing in the hallway. "What's he talking about?" Cecily asked, completely lost. "He had a bad experience last night. Stay with him, please," Shelley begged, wanting this to go well. Cecily nodded and went to keep Derek company. Shelley went back to the control booth. Tobias came in just as the story reached its midpoint, and the audience was making appreciative noises. Voice rolled. He turned and left Cecily and Shelley standing in the hallway. "What's he talking about?" Cecily asked, completely lost. "He had a bad experience last night. Stay with him, please," Shelley begged, wanting this to go well. Cecily nodded and went to keep Derek company. Shelley went back to the control booth. Tobias came in just as the story reached its midpoint, and the audience was making appreciative noises. His voice rolled. He turned and left Cecily and Shelley standing in the hallway. "What's he talking about?" Cecily asked, completely lost. "He had a bad experience last night. Stay with him, please," Shelley begged, wanting this to go well. Cecily nodded and went to keep Derek company. Shelley went back to the control booth. Tobias came in just as the story reached its midpoint, and the audience was making appreciative noises. His voice rolled. He turned and left Cecily and Shelley standing in the hallway. "What's he talking about?" Cecily asked, completely lost. "He had a bad experience last night. Stay with him, please," Shelley begged, wanting this to go well. Cecily nodded and went to keep Derek company. Shelley went back to the control booth. Tobias came in just as the story reached its midpoint, and the audience was making appreciative noises. His voice rolled. He turned and left Cecily and Shelley standing in the hallway. "What's he talking about?" Cecily asked, completely lost. "He had a bad experience last night. Stay with him, please," Shelley begged, wanting this to go well. Cecily nodded and went to keep Derek company. Shelley went back to the control booth. Tobias came in just as the story reached its midpoint, and the audience was making appreciative noises. His voice rolled. He turned and left Cecily and Shelley standing in the hallway. "What's he talking about?" Cecily asked, completely lost. "He had a bad experience last night. Stay with him, please," Shelley begged, wanting this to go well. Cecily nodded and went to keep Derek company. Shelley went back to the control booth. Tobias came in just as the story reached its midpoint, and the audience was making appreciative noises. His voice rolled. He turned and left Cecily and Shelley standing in the hallway. "What's he talking about?" Cecily asked, completely lost. "He had a bad experience last night. Stay with him, please," Shelley begged, wanting this to go well. Cecily nodded and went to keep Derek company. Shelley went back to the control booth. Tobias came in just as the story reached its midpoint, and the audience was making appreciative noises. His voice rolled. He turned and left Cecily and Shelley standing in the hallway. "What's he talking about?" Cecily asked, completely lost. "He had a bad experience last night.